Pop quiz. You're going camping for a weekend. 3 days, rains in the forecast. You're going to be cooking over a fire, sweating, sleeping in a tent, getting in and out of a lake. Which watch are you going to be wearing? I'll bet a lot of money it's not the watch that we spent a ton of time talking about last week. Let's get into the other end of this hobby today.
You wear it on the road, you wear it in the smoke. When the grid goes dark, that old steel still knows. G-Shock on your wrist, CWC by the seal. Marathon in the mud, ticking through the reel.
Welcome back to What's on Your Restate. I'm Watchovski. We spent 4 episodes, Rolex, Renaud and Papi, we called them R&P, Rexhep, and we spent some time on the philosophy that kind of connects all of them. Talking about watches and whose value kind of lives in your understanding of them. Watches that you take seriously, that I take seriously, the community takes seriously. Watches whose meaning is kind of delicate. And today is the opposite. You can kind of tell that I do this palate cleansing when I deliver this information. That's sort of the way that I think as well. So today is about the watches that ask nothing of you, the watches you don't really take off, the watches whose value lives entirely in what they let you stop thinking about. So today's kind of the reset button. Tool watches, the ones built for actual work and actual world. So I'm going to cover 6 full brands, not all the way down their entire lineup. And I'm going to give you a couple of honorable mentions because it hurts my feelings to leave out brands that I really like. And then a thesis about why this category, which I think the watch internet sometimes treats like the kiddie pool, and it's not. It's actually, I think, one of the most important categories in this entire hobby. So settle in. We're going outside today. We need to get some sun. I think it's good for you. Go touch some grass. So segment 1, we're going to call the reset button. Why this episode exists. Let me set this up before we start running through brands because there's a particular reason I wanted to start this episode right after the Rexhep one. If you've been listening to the show again for 13 episodes and one, thank you so much for that. It means a lot. You've heard me talk about watchmaking that asks for your attention, hand finishing on a Chopek movement, the clock tower remontoire on the Gronefeld, the Bombay bridges of the Rexhep Rexhepi, right? The kind of watchmaking that is kind of the apex of this hobby. It's also, in a real way, in a real life way, it's demanding. You take those watches off when you load the dishwasher. You take them off to mow the lawn. You take them off when you go to the gym. You don't wear them on the camping trip, and definitely not in the rain. The watches we're going to talk about today are the opposite of that. They're watches built under this single, unembarrassed promise. You don't need to take me off. You wear me to do the dishes. You wear me to load lumber into the truck. You wear me to soccer practice in a hailstorm to watch your kids. You wear me to the airport, through TSA, on a long flight, off the plane, into the rental car, right? Loading luggage in and out, in the rain. All of those places, guess what? This watch is going to work without ceremony. It will just work without you having to think about it. And that's not a lesser kind of watch. That's a different relationship in watchmaking, to the point where some people, that's all they wear. And if you're one of those people, again, I envy you. And here's the thing I want every listener to internalize about this category, because I think the watch internet sometimes gets this wrong. And again, you'll see me having these conversations with you about the mass amount of information that we get and how people are supposed to do this or supposed to do that. And then everyone kind of follows that trend. And I just don't like it. I think the tool watch doesn't compete with the dress watch. The tool watch makes the dress watch possible. Let me say that again. The tool watch does not compete with the dress watch. The tool watch makes the dress watch possible. If you don't have a beater on your wrist for the messy parts of life, the camping trips, the workouts, the times you get, you generally don't want to think about your watch, you would only have the precious watches. And then you'd either take them off and you'd damage them, or you'd take them off and you'd be entirely without a watch, which for some of us in this hobby is kind of suffering. That suntan spot that we've got, the patch that's circular on our wrist is insufferable. Mine is actually dented, right? It's shaped. I have a watch shaped indentation on my wrist that just begs to put a watch on just to fill the void. The tool watch really frees up the rest of your collection to be precious if you wanted it to be. And so today we're going to walk through 6 brands that do this category, I think, at the highest level. And again, my category is not your category. I'm mentioning the ones that I think are significant enough in my space to discuss, but not the be all end all. So don't think that this is me a ranking system of like this is the best, and if they didn't get included here, they don't exist. That's not how it is. I only have so much time, and honestly, again, with the 3 kids and all of that other stuff, I do my best to just try to get a good survey of some of this information. And so climbing from what I would consider the most accessible to maybe the most technically sophisticated, or at least what I would consider technically sophisticated, we're starting with the watch that most of you have already owned probably in your life, and then ending with something that I think is kind of the engineering apex of what modern tool watches kind of look like. So, segment 2, we're going to call G-Shock the watch that made the category. Let's start with G-Shock. G-Shock. I'm not going to insult your intelligence with a long history lesson here. Casio, it's actually Casio. It's Japanese, and again, my maybe I'll do better with Japanese than I did with French, and probably not. Definitely not German. They launched the original G-Shock, the model. It was the DW-5000C in 1983. So 42 years ago, and it was designed by an engineer. And here goes me messing stuff up, right? Kikuo Ibe. It's Kikuo and then Ibe, who reportedly went through more than 200 prototypes trying to build a watch that could survive basically a 10-meter drop, and then also had 10 atmospheres of water pressure with a 10-year battery life. And basically what he called this was the triple 10 philosophy. Maybe I taught you something new there. You never know. He famously tested these early prototypes by dropping them from the window of his Tokyo apartment. And the G-Shock had since, the part makes me giggle because I'm visually, I can see somebody who's an engineer for a company, right, bringing these prototypes home and just dropping them out their window, which is just, that's rad. So the G-Shock had, since 1983, become, by some measures, the most successful tool watch line in human history. Like hundreds of millions of units sold. The watch is on the wrists of military operators, and I know we have military friends and family, uh, the gentlemen that have served overseas, folks that are SWAT and sheriffs and that kind of stuff. They're on their wrists. So military operators, professional photographers, mountaineers, NBA players, oil rig workers, probably like half the kids in any given American middle school. It crosses every demographic that exists. If you were to go to a sporting event, for example, you'll probably see one on somebody's wrist. So, for the purposes of today, 3 references I think that kind of matter most: the DW-5610 and its variants, the square, the original kind of shape, the watch most people picture when you say G-Shock. It's about $50, like $50 for a watch that is functionally indestructible, world time, stopwatch, alarm, countdown timer, has an EL backlight, uh, 200 meters of water resistance now, and still the 10-year battery life. And then there's really no scenario in your daily life that the 5610 won't do its job. Then there's the GW-M5610. It's the Solar Atomic radio variant. It's, again, same square case, but it's solar charged, and so you never need a battery again. Picks up radio signals from atomic clocks around the world, and it auto corrects its time. And this one, you're going to jump up a little bit. Now you're at about $150. Again, solar atomic watch for $150. And in other industry, that basically would be impossible. And then this is where it became kind of the watch's internet obsession a few years ago, the GA-2100. We all know this one as the Casioak, the Casioak. That's my worst Mr. Miyagi impression ever, right? Wax on, wax off. So because of the octagonal case, the integrate, I'm gonna give you a second to process what just happened to you. Because the octagonal case, the integrated strap design, I think is unmistakably evokes this Audemars Piguet Royal Oak about for like $100. And so there's an analog digital hybrid, there's a carbon core case, and genuinely, it's like a beautiful object in its own merits. And so, regardless of the whole Royal Oak comparison, the GA 2100 it's a cool watch. Now, if you don't own a G-Shock right now or like any G-Shocks, I think you're missing kind of the fundamental tool in your toolbox. So maybe start the podcast over, order a 5610, which I don't normally tell you to do that kind of stuff, but like 5610 from like Amazon will be on your wrist by like, a couple days. And then move on with your life. And then we'll just, we'll just wait here while you have your 5610. Okay. I will pause this moment. No, I'm just kidding. So segment 3, let's get into Citizen Promaster, every man's professional watch. So next is interesting. The Citizen Promaster, Pro as in Pro Master. Citizen's the brand that, in my view, is the most underrated big name watchmaker in the world for a variety of reasons. They make over 1 million watches a year. They own Bulova, they own Frederic Constant, Alpina, and then also Arnold and Son. And Arnold and Son it's a big player, as is Frederic Constant. And so they're the parent company of quietly in this enormous watch empire, and almost nobody outside of Japan really even talks about them. The ProMaster line is Citizen's tool watch arm, so launched in like I think 1989. Somebody correct me on that one if I'm wrong on that. And they were built around one specific technology commitment, the Eco Drive, and most everyone here knows the Eco Drive, right? So it's a solar charging system as developed by Citizen that uses basically light, sunlight, indoor light, a desk lamp to charge this watch's internal battery. It doesn't care what kind of light it's getting, it just needs light. And the battery is designed to last decades. Now, in practice, you may never service the power source on an Eco Drive in your lifetime. I have watches that are from the 90s that I found after when my parents had passed away and I went into old drawers and was helping clean out the house. I found my high school and college Citizens, and one of them, actually both of them they were both old Citizens, and one of them needed a battery. I popped a new battery in, and guess what? Popped right back up, and now it still works, and I still actually keep that watch. And so again, these references I think are fascinating. People have reported that the units, the Eco Drives from the 1990s, are still running on their original batteries, still using rechargeable ambient light. So it's been great. For us, 3, I think ProMaster references are important. So there's the BN0150, and that's known as kind of the ProMaster diver, and it's lovingly called the Fugu. That's Fugu. Who thought I was going to say the letters FU on this podcast? But there you go. Fugu, the Japanese, it references a Japanese puffer fish. And because the crown guards look like the spines of this fish. And it's interesting because, 44 millimeters, it's a 200-meter diver. It's got eco solar. It's actually ISO 6425 certified as like a real dive watch. And again, about $250. $250 for a fully certified ISO diver with solar power that you probably never need a service on. The Fugu is the watch I recommend to people who ask me, "Hey, I want a dive watch under $300." And it is, I think, dollar for dollar, one of the best tool watches that's ever been made. And again, no one talks about it. And then when you go and actually talk to people who are in the water a lot and divers, a lot of them are wearing Citizens. Then there's the Aqualand. It's Aqualand, and it's the watch that Citizen launched in 1985. And technically, it was the first wristwatch with this kind of integrated depth gauge. And so, like a real integrated depth gauge. So the dive community took the watch seriously the moment that it landed. And the modern Aqualand, it's now, I think, in its 3rd generation, and it remains one of the most mainstream watches with a integrated depth sensor. And then finally, there's the Skyhawk, the Aviator's Skyhawk. They call it the ProMaster, and it's a multi-band atomic radio. It's a world time, has a slide rule bezel, a perpetual calendar, and this is around $600. And it's the kind of watch that a working pilot might genuinely strap on their wrist as a daily. And my brother actually has one. I'm gonna go reach across my desk real quick. So hold on one second. So the watch that my brother actually wore was a Citizen EcoDrive Nighthawk R200. So this was the watch that was on his wrist when he passed away. And so I have this watch, and it's very, very special to me. So I keep this watch with me. It has the normal crown at 3 o'clock, and then has a crown on the opposite side to rotate the inner bezel And that one's around 8 o'clock on that side. So I keep that watch with me. It's super important. So whenever I hear Skyhawks or even like the Nighthawks, I have a special place for those in my heart. And so the reason I think the ProMasters specifically is kind of the most adult tool watch choice I think that you can make at this price point is that it just does its job. So I would say that G-Shock is kind of like the wild kid in the family, and the ProMaster is kind of the older sibling who studied engineering, drinks coffee, has been quietly doing serious work for decades. And so again, I can't recommend the Citizen ProMaster enough, nor can I recommend the G-Shocks enough. They're just wonderful watches. Okay, so now we're going to get into segment 4. Let's get into Seiko Prospex, the Japanese workhorse. All right, so third, the Seiko Prospex, and it's Prospex. If G-Shock and ProMaster are kind of the gateway watches, Prospex or Prospex is where enthusiasts start to take tool watches more seriously. So quick housekeeping, the Prospex, it actually stands for something. It's not just, right, the catchy phrase. It actually stands for professional specifications. And again, hopefully maybe you learned something just now. And it's Seiko's umbrella for their tool watch line. They launched this with this very distinct designation in around 2014. And again, correct me if I'm wrong there, but I believe it was 2014. But the watches in the Prospex line, the references, the architectures, the design DNA, they go back like decades. And we're really talking about Seiko's kind of modern tool watch lineage. So it's just fascinating to kind of know that. So the names that you need to know, this one's going to be the most obvious. If you're in this space, you know this one. So the SKX. Yes, technically it was discontinued in like 2019. I apologize for bringing it up if you're still sensitive about that. The prices on the used market have gone up. The SKX-07, the SKX-09, those were like direct successors to the legendary 7002 and then earlier the 6309. And they're watches that I think on any other single line, they taught a generation of watch enthusiasts how to love mechanical dive watches. And then fun fact about the SKX-07, that bracelet that fits on that actually fits on the Smith's 40 millimeter that they don't make anymore. They had a 40 millimeter Everest with a plexiglass crystal, and those bracelets are interchangeable. So if you have one of those, just a heads up that's an Easter egg that I've millimeter Smiths for a while. So, okay, so getting back to this is interesting. The 7S26 auto movement, it's not, again, it's not the most accurate movement on earth, but it's absurdly durable and it's hand windable. And then on from like 2019, they via the 4R36 and then the SKX, kind of this spiritual ancestor. They're 42.5 millimeters. The hands, the dial, the case, the Jubilee on the SKX-009, they're fantastic. So every single watch enthusiast that came up through like the 2000s and the early 2010s probably has a story about their SKX, whether they loved the bracelet or they hated it or whatever. It was so jangly and this and that, but then they would complain about it, but then they would love it because it was comfortable, right? And so the turtle is the next one I want to talk about. The references, typically the ones that you're going to see is SRP-777 and then all of the successors after that. And there's so many variants. Cushion case for kind of this modern revival of the Seiko's 1976. They had a 6309 and it wears huge on the wrist and it looks like nothing else. They're I wouldn't say dinner plates because they're not circular. They're very much turtle shaped. And they're just I love those watches. They even on smaller wrists, I think when you put those on, it's like it's sort of like a Panerai. I think once you wear a turtle or something like that, the millimeters kind of go away and you just kind of enjoy the watch. And then also the way that the lugs are designed is they basically go straight down. So once you have those, your bracelet or your strap or whatever, you're not really going by case size. You're just going from lug to lug, which is it's a more manageable size. So the monster, people who when I get into bigger case sizes, we'll talk about the monster. The SRP 307, the SRP 309, the SRPD 25. Again, a long lineage, way more that I could mention. It's the most aggressive Seiko diver, has sharp teeth, like sharp teeth on the bezel, has these oversized indices. It's completely like unsubtle. And it's honestly a cult favorite for it's been a cult favorite for years. There's the Sumo, the SBDC line. It's kind of more the mid-size. They they carry more of like a defined, kind of refined diver kind of a feel. And what I think some people call the Sumo is kind of the budget Grand Seiko diver. and it's by people who get kind of carried away on forums, but I think it can carry the weight, and it should get some praise as well. There's also the Samurai. It's an angular, more modern, kind of a bit polarizing visually, and again, it's enormously well built. For me, again, one of the more beautiful watches, but again, we all have our different tastes. And then sitting above all of these is the newer SPB series. And these are built around Seiko's more improved or newly kind of refined 6R movements, and they have a longer power reserve and they have better regulation that's a little bit tighter. And these start to creep up into like the $800 to $1,200 range in US. And they've kind of genuinely gone into this like Swiss mid tier money. And I think the watches earn it. Now, again, a lot of people will complain that Seiko's prices have kind of crept up as well. And I think their MSRPs have crept up. But again, when you buy pre-owned or if you buy from an authorized dealer, typically you're getting discounts and that kind of stuff. And then a lot of times when you see MSRP, that's not the price that you're paying for a Seiko. Okay. So where the, underrated thing about so let me phrase this correctly. So I think here's the thing about underrating prospects, for example. Most Western enthusiasts, and I will include myself in the Western enthusiasts of thinking about Seiko tool watches, they think of them as like cheap mechanical alternatives to the Swiss divers. They are not. I see them as parallel in this tradition. Seiko has been making professional divers since 1965. Literally, the 62 Moss, for example, independently developed their own dive watch and their own design language in Japan on a completely separate track from anything in Switzerland. And so the fact that you can buy a Seiko tool diver for a few $100 doesn't make it a budget alternative or a version to anything. It makes it its own thing. And I think it's funny too when people talk about, well, I want to get an in-house this or that. And I'm like, well, basically all of the movements that you're getting from Seiko are in-house because they're coming from Seiko. And so I think it's fast just because other movement manufacturers are using those movements. I mean, yeah, they're sourcing movements, but Seiko's movements are in-house. They are literally making every component for their watches. And so I think it makes it its own thing. And so priced according to what Japan's manufacturing model is versus what Switzerland's model and marketing is. And so they're two different things. So again, the Prospex line, I think in my opinion, it's this enthusiast tool watch, and so if you only had, to pick a one mechanical tool watch in your collection, like under $1,500, you'd be I think, very hard pressed to find something that would be better in that lineup. Okay, segment 5, I'm gonna get into Marathon, the watch that's actually on, soldiers' wrists. So we're gonna pivot a little bit from the civilian favorites and get into more of the military-focused ones. So our 4th brand, and here's kind of where I think my episode's gonna take a turn a little bit. Until now, we've been talking about brands that make tool watches that kinda look military, G-Shock, Promaster, Prospex, and some of them do actually get in there, but then there's tool watches, and again, those are tool watches that consumers buy because, again, they're tough, they're capable. Yes, militaries use them, sometimes informally, but now we're gonna actually talk about brands that actually hold contracts with military forces, brands that are literally used by soldiers. So Marathon Watch Company, again from Toronto, Canada, they were founded in like the 1930s, so 1939, I believe. Morris, I think, was the gentleman's first name, and then Wen, it's Wein, I believe, was his last name. And he was making watches for allies during World War II. And so the brand ever since focused on like one specific market. Specifically, they were supplying watches to military forces and government agencies. And particularly, they were supplying them for the US Department of Defense as well as Canadian Armed Forces. And they've done this continuously for like 80 years. So if you've ever in your life met an active duty American or Canadian service member who was issued a watch, and they get issued particular units and roles. This isn't like every soldier. There is a very real chance that they were issued a marathon. The brand is, I think, in the strictest sense, a defense contractor that happens to make watches. So the references that kind of matter is known as the GSAR. It's the GSAR, Government Search and Rescue. It's a 41 millimeter automatic, 200-meter water resistance watch. It typically runs an ETA 2824, and this technology is kind of defines the brand. It has genuine tritium gas tubes on the hands, indices, and then typically on like the bezel pip. And then tritium is a radioactive isotope. Again, if you know the stuff from my organic chemistry majors here, hydrogen 3, so it's H3. So radioactive isotope hydrogen dash 3, H3. And it's sealed in these teeny tiny little glass capillaries on the watch's dial and hands, and they glow continuously. They don't need to be charged. There's no charging required. And they run for 12 to 15 years. Again, no light source is required, dark room, total darkness, in a foxhole, in a submarine, in a tunnel. The watch just glows. It does not depend on you having to charge the loom or go outside. And so there's different variants of the gases, for example, ones that are working in like total darkness. You don't want your watch glowing. And so sometimes you use darker ones like reds, for example, and you can kind of they just glow just a bit. But if you're in total darkness, it's just enough, right? For other ones, they will obviously use different colorings and you can get brighter ones. So then there's also the MSAR, the medium search and rescue. It's smaller, it's a 36 millimeter. Again, same tritium tubes, quartz movement in this one. It's designed as a more wearable version of the GSAR, and it's really for like everyday duty. And there's a navigator. It's a pilot's watch. Again, tritium tube, smaller case, lighter quartz, designed for like cockpit use. And then there's the JSAR. It's the jumbo search and rescue, 46 millimeters automatic. It's kind of the big wristed version of like the marathon. And so here's the thing that makes Marathon, I think, special, and the reason it belongs in this episode. Marathon doesn't market. They don't have, again, celebrity ambassadors. They don't run sponsored content. They don't pay watch YouTubers. The brand sells through specific defense and government channels. And the same watches that are made available to civilians through a number of small authorized dealers are basically essentially the same watches that are going on the military wrists. And the watches that are on the wrists of Coast Guard rescue swimmers in like the North Atlantic, it's literally the same watch that's going to be issued to a civilian that they could order today. And that's the kind of authenticity I think is rare, like genuine military supply, not military aesthetic, right? I think in that space, you sort of, there's almost this like cosplay type stuff of folks that sort of look military, right? Versus the brothers and sisters that actually have served. And so again, it's rare. It's not military aesthetic. It's that is the line. Okay. Now, segment 6, we're going to get into CWC. It's the British Insider's Choice, and it's one of I think it's one of the good stories that we can get into this episode where CWC actually replaced the Rolex Mill Sub, and so I'm going to tell a little bit about that story. And so the fifth brand, we're going to be switching continents. It's Cabot Watch Company, and it's CWC, known to most everyone. Founded in 1972 by a man named Ray Mellor. It's Mellor, and he was in the UK. And the story of CWC exists as one of kind of my favorite stories in this entire genre. So Ray had served in the Merchant Navy during World War II, and he was on the HMS Queen Elizabeth. So he was ferrying American troops across the Atlantic. And after the war, he went into the watch industry. And eventually, he became managing director of Hamilton in the UK, and the British arm of the American watchmaker, obviously Hamilton. And for folks that don't know, obviously they think Hamilton is, it's under the Swatch Group, so it's a Swiss brand. Hamilton was originally a U.S. watch brand. And then in that role, Ray became the man responsible for supplying watches to the British military's defense, so the Ministry of Defense. So they call them typically the MOD. And M is capitalized, little o, and then capital D. And so in the early 1970s, the quartz crisis hit Hamilton, and it hit Hamilton hard. And the company decided to close its UK operations, and the MOD was about to lose its watch supplier. And so Ray's response was to start his own watch company, and specifically to keep supplying the British armed forces with watches. And so he named it Cabot Watch Company after Cabot, after John Cabot. He was an Italian-born explorer who claimed Newfoundland or England, I think in like the 1400s, 1490s. I could be wrong. I'm going to throw out 1497, 1498, somewhere in there. So Mellor put it on the dial because, in his words, the company would do for British military watchmaking what Cabot had done for British exploration. And so and then in like 1980, and this is the part that's interesting, CWC won the contract to replace Rolex, the Rolex Submariner, as the official issue dive watch for the Royal Navy. Now, I need you to sit with this for a second, okay? The Royal Navy has been issuing Rolex Submariners, or had been issuing Rolex Submariners, specifically the Mill Sub, like the iconic military spec Submariner, to their divers since like the 1950s. The Mill Sub is, I think, in the collector circle today, is one of the most coveted watches in the entire vintage Rolex universe. And original examples, they sell at auction for like the price of houses, okay? The MOD looked at Rolex's pricing in the 1980s and decided they needed a more cost-effective option, and so CWC won the contract. And the Rolex Mill Sub was replaced by the CWC Royal Navy Diver Automatic, and then in 1982 by the Quartz Royal Navy Diver. So CWC has, been the Royal Navy's diver's official issued watch for watch suppliers for like 50 years. And so in 1987, the MOD, they commissioned another CWC dive watch, the one specifically for special boat service, and you see this as a like SBS, and it's Britain's elite maritime special forces. Think of them kind of like, I guess for us it would be like the SEALs, right? So they're roughly the equivalent of the U.S. Navy SEALs, and it's the watch that resulted the CWC is the watch that you should know if you take this category seriously. It's 43 millimeters, 300 meters of water resistance. It's a black PVD case. It's quartz. It's issued to every SBS person that's in that force, and it's been if they've gone into conflict, for example, they've used those watches since like the 1980s. Like the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, ongoing operations, they're currently issued. Active duty British Special Forces are wearing CWC SBS divers like today. There's probably somebody in the water with one right now. And here's the thing about the CWC that I want to leave you with. They don't flex. The brand is owned by like Silverman's. It's a London military equipment supplier. They founded in like 1946. Their website like looks like a website. Their marketing is non-existent. Their watches are sold direct to consumers at what I would consider fair prices. Some people would say CWC watches are a little bit expensive for what they are. And I think when you know some of the history and you also know the brand, you're basically paying, I think, somewhat direct prices. Now, other folks would disagree with me there and say that they're overpriced. I don't think that they're overpriced. I think that they're fairly priced. And again, alongside with these military contract productions, I think that's pretty wild. Now, if you want a genuine, documentable, currently being issued to special forces provenance, then the CWC SBS is one of the very few options, I think, in the entire global watch space that is not military aesthetic, it's military issue. So the other CWC to know is the G10. The General Service Quartz field is it's a watch that's been issued to virtually every branch of the British Armed Forces since like the 1980s. It's a tiny case. It's about 36 millimeters. I say tiny. It's a smaller case. Has fixed bars, and a lot of those CWC watches that you're going to find will have fixed bars. So just be aware of that. If you're not a strap person, you need to figure out a system that will clip onto that bar, similar to like the quick release system that they have on like some of the Zenith pilot watches. And so they've again fixed bars, military spec down to like the gasket, and then hundreds of thousands of these have been issued to British soldiers, and civilians can buy one for around 300 quid, is what they would say, $300, right? And that's the same watch that is on the wrist of British armed squaddies, like in basic training right now. And so the CWC is quietly, I think, one of the most legitimate brands in this entire category, and most American collectors really haven't heard of them, and they should. And for me as an American collector, for example, I have a soft spot for CWC, and it's grown. So I didn't for a while, and slowly that appreciation for that brand is growing. Segment 7, we're going to get into Sinn. Now, people will say Sinn as it's spelled Sinn, and I've heard it pronounced Sinn, and I've also heard it pronounced Sinn. I believe the Germans actually say Sinn with a sound at the beginning, but then it has a little hint of a Z in it. So if you say Sinn or Sin, I'm good with it either way. I will probably say Sinn because that's how I was trained in this watch space. We're going to call this kind of the German engineering. I'll say that the Apex. Now, there are other Apexes, obviously, but this will be mine. So the Sinn, and then we're going to get into the Spezialisten. But I don't know. It's the specialist version. So the Sinn Specialist watch, and you'll see that's Spezialuhren. Spezialisturen. Something like that. Those Sinn Specialist watches, they're based in Frankfurt, and they're still in Frankfurt, Germany. They were founded in 1961 by Helmut Sinn, and he was a former pilot who started making watches for working professionals. And so if you remember Helmut Sinn from like my episode 9, he's the man who personally, his personal collection of 1950s ETA caliber 1120s. Those movements ended up in the Dornbluth Yasmin models. That's the helmet Sinn I'm talking about. Founder of Sinn watches, friend of independent watchmaking, and he's a post-war German aviation legend. And he sold the brand in 1994 to a watchmaker named Lothar Schmidt. And he was formerly the IWC. He was part of the IWC engineering team, and so Schmidt's been running the company ever since, and that was in 1994. Now, under Schmidt, Sinn has become the engineering-led tool watch brand. So every Sinn watch is built around solving specific problems that working professionals encounter. The solutions that Sinn has invented have been adopted in some form by like half of the industry. And again, it's similar to one of those scenarios like where you have Mercedes-Benz, for example, and some of their safety features, and then a lot of the other brands in the space use those patents or they have permission to use patents for safety features. Now, for Sinn, we're talking about these solutions that they've created, and then again, the rest of the industry are using some of these things. So again, three technologies that I want to cover that Sinn kind of defines themselves by. Now, tegumented technology, it's basically a surface hardening process that takes standard 316L stainless steel, and it takes it from around 220 Vickers, which is like a hardness rating. And that's kind of the standard hardness rating for stainless steel. And it's going to push it to 1200 Vickers. Now, in some reports, it goes well beyond 1200, but that's what they're rating it at. And so what ends up happening is these scratches that would normally occur on a normal stainless steel case, they don't affect the 1200 Vicker tegumenting process. And so what ends up happening is you get a watch that's a bit more durable. And again, it's not a coating, it's not like a plating, it's actually like a molecular surface of the steel is restructured. And so like a Sinn 856, for example, it brand new will look off the factory shelf, and then 15 years later, it will look very, very similar. Now, some other people will beat them, within an inch of their lives. And so, yeah, they'll get dings and that kind of stuff. But the scratching and stuff is a little bit more difficult to do. And again, long-term owners have reported this across a lot of forums. And so it is, I think, without exaggeration, one of the more successful case hardening technologies in the watch industry. Now, there's another one called AR dehumidifying technology. And so for many tool watches, they fog up internally when they experience rapid temperature or pressure changes. And so if, say, for example, you're diving in cold water and then, you've been flying out of a jet, for example, you jumped out of a plane, then you jump into cold water and then you get out and then it's 100 degrees on the beach, right? These massive pressurization changes, depressurizing in a cargo, going from fast altitude descents and ascents, for example. Sinn solved a lot of this by filling the case with argon gas. So AR, you'll see that on some of them. You'll see it on the periodic table, you'll see it as capital A and then little r. And so there's basically this inert, dry material, and it will displace oxygen and moisture. And so they also include this copper sulfate drying capsule, and it's actually inside the case. And so the result is that a Sinn does not fog, like ever, in any condition. And so magnetic field protection is another one. So many Sinn watches, they feature this like soft inner iron case, and you may hear this, you'll hear terms like magnetic cage, for example, and it creates this basically a Faraday cage around the movement, and it protects the movement from magnetic fields up to like 80,000 amperes. And so it's kind of well beyond what any consumer environment would generate. And so originally they were engineered to keep pilots' watches running near some of the cockpit controls, and like the watches are just, I think they're fantastic. And so I'm going to get into a couple of them. The 556, for example, is kind of Sinn's entry point, and I don't consider it an entry point watch. It can very much be your one and done kind of watch. The 556 is a 38.5 millimeter watch. It's typically a three-hand automatic. It runs a 2824 ETA. And it's the watch that I recommend to folks who are saying like, well, what's like the gateway into Sinn? It's about $1,500. You can get them now with the adjustable clasps and on the fly adjustment. And they're built, it's hard to explain a Sinn build to people unless they've actually held them. They just have a very sturdy, solid feel. The way that the bracelet is constructed, the way that it's finished, it's very tool looking, but on the wrist, it's very, very comfortable, but it's also substantial. And so they will use, for example, some might have a pin and collar in some watches. Other people may use screws. They're using opposing, basically, you're going to be using opposing Allen wrenches to lock in the bracelet on both sides. And so what ends up happening is you can spin the bolt that runs through it, and so your bracelet will never essentially back itself out. Those screws will never back themselves out. But they're also just really well constructed bracelets. And so on like the 556, for example, or the 104, those bracelets that have like the H link, they're just awesome and they feel sturdy. They feel German, as I guess the way I would say it is. If you ever shut the door on like an Audi or a Porsche or a Mercedes, that thud kind of a feel, it translates that into a watch. The 856, for example, it's kind of the daily that defines the brand. It's a 46 millimeter. It's bead blasted tegamented steel, has the AR dehumidifying. It has a 2824, and it's around 2 grand. Prices have all crept up. So as you're listening to this, they might be more than this, obviously, as things get more expensive in the world. And it's the watch that I would point to as kind of the archetype, the sort of a modern tool watch. It's a reasonable size. It has maximum tech, and it's built to last forever. But it's nothing flashy. So when a lot of people sometimes they are not fans of Sinn, sometimes they say, well, they just look like regular watches, right? They just look like a regular watch. And I think for a lot of people, that's exactly what they want. They want a simple watch that they can tell time, that's very legible, that isn't flashy. And the 104, for example, the 856, the 556, they're just solid, reliable, working watches. They're not flashy though. And so then there's the U series, the letter U, as in U1 and U50. They are Sinn's professional dive watch family. They're made from German submarine steel. Yes, that's actually like a real material designation. And it's the steel that they would use for building the hulls of the German submarines. And then they take that steel and then they tegament it, and it becomes very highly like water resistant. So the U1 is this 44 millimeter, and then the U50, I believe, is a 41 millimeter, and you can correct me if I missed that. But again, same engineering, just for a smaller wrist. And the watch that I want to get close with on this segment is the UX GSG-9. And it's the watch that's issued to the German Federal Police, specifically their elite counter-terrorist unit. And it's formed kind of after the Munich Olympics, the hostage crisis. It's a 5,000. Now, remember, again, before I get into more of my specs, Sinn was a brand, or they are a brand that works to what? They work to solve problems. And so when the Munich Olympics, the hostage situation happened, they basically created this watch. It's a 5,000-meter water-resistant watch. It's has this hydro tech, which basically is the case is filled with a colorless silicone oil that makes it both reflection-free underwater and pressure-resistant to depths that no human will ever reach. The tegamented submarine steel is included, and it's quartz because tactical units need specific accuracy without daily winding, and the watch that German counter-terror operators are issued. And you can buy one, again, as a civilian. It's several thousand euros, but it's like nothing you've ever seen before. There is zero glare. And if you've ever seen this where you take your watch and you're underwater and you kind of tilt it a certain way, and then the dial completely disappears and all you see is like a mirror, that does not happen on these oil-filled watches. You can completely see it at basically every single angle. Now, Sinn is, again, in my view, the most technically sophisticated tool watch brand in the world. Like every other brand in this episode does one or two things kind of well, and that's worth for the consideration to consider picking one up if you don't have one already. I think Sinn does like 8 things well, and it does like all of them really, really well. And they keep inventing new ones. And so if you've ever wanted to like consider this engineering apex of tool watches, I don't, and you don't need military issue provenance. I think Sinn is really the claim to fame. Sinn doesn't really claim any of this stuff. They just do it. They've gotten to the point where they have some machines, for example, that they've worked to test their watches, and the watches can break machines because they just keep pushing them, and as a result, then they go, okay, well now we have to build a better machine. That's kind of how their brains are. Now, let me get into my honorable mentions because there's going to be a lot that you're going to go, whoa, 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 dude, you forgot like a bunch of them. So I'll do my best to throw a couple out to keep the hate comments down. Honorable mentions before I go, I'll throw out the Tudor Pelagos, the FXD. It's Tudor's professional diver. It's on a fixed bar strap. It's kind of their military spec variant. And the FXD was actually commissioned by the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, in 2021. And it's actually issued to French combat swimmers. So, yes, Tudor, which is owned by Rolex, is now a genuine military supplier. Again, right? So, 42 millimeters in house MT5602 movement. It's a titanium case. It's around 4,200 bucks or so, but again, they're creeping up in price as of this recording. They actually may be out more already. And this is kind of the watch that proves that you can buy kind of a luxury tool watch, but it'll still have military provenance now. There's also Damasco. It's Sinn's, I think, quieter German cousin. They're family owned. They're based in, I think, Regensburg. I could be wrong about that. They have ice hardened steel, again, submarine steel bracelets, and then their own in-house movements that are on the higher end models. And they have, they're smaller, they're less famous than Sinn. And the watch enthusiasts really, they know who they are. So they know Damasco, for example. There's also the Hamilton Khaki Field. That's a pretty obvious choice for most people. It's the same American brand whose UK operations ended in 1972, and they were kind of leading to the foundation or the founding, the origins of CWC. And so still they make the khaki field line, has a direct lineage back to those watches that Hamilton supplied to the American GIs in like World War II. Again, mechanical, around 600 bucks. They're moving up a little bit in price. The H50 is a hand wound version of it, but they also have them with the Powermatic 80s in them as well. And so you can get tool watches with tool watch heritage, again, at accessible prices. And then there's a bunch of other ones. There's Marathon's original field. There's the Seiko 5 sports line. There's the Citizen Tough series. There's Bell and Ross tactical pieces. So tons and tons and tons of those watches that are available. And I think as you kind of get into this, you can also get into like Hanhart, for example, and Hanhart making the preventer models, and specifically these ones that have not just hardened steel, but they've actually changed the steel itself so that it's not just a coating or anything that's been applied to kind of the surface of the steel. It's all the way through. So the HD12, for example, you should kind of check those out. Okay, now let's get into kind of the reset button of this episode. So we're gonna get back to this thesis. So we talked about 6 brands, kind of the honorable mentions that I threw out, and we really went from like 50 bucks to around 4 grand or maybe a little bit more. We went from a plastic G-Shock to the German Federal Counter-Terror Unit's commissioned diver. And I think that's the range of what a modern tool watch is. So here's what I want you to take away from this episode. There's a particular kind of relief. And I think every enthusiast feels this, even the ones that don't admit it. They have a watch on their wrist that generally they don't have to think about, a watch that they can drop without panicking, a watch you can take into salt water, a watch you can wear in conditions that anyone else in any other watch in your collection, you'd have a challenge to do. And so again, if you don't have these tool watches, or at least a tool watch in your collection, it may be worth something to consider. Think about a watch whose entire job is to remove itself from your consciousness, that you can just go grab it and then do whatever you're going to do for your day. And I think that is the reset button. And I think every watch collection typically should have something like that. And I don't typically say like, oh, your watch collection should have this and this and this and this. But I think you should have, if you go outside and you do things, or you're with your kids and you're pushing them on swings, or you're like me and you're wrestling with them and we're gardening and jumping into the pool and, taking dogs on walks and all that kind of stuff. I'm probably not going to do that with a high horology watch, right? Specifically jumping into the pool, right? So again, there's a reset button for your collection. There's the watch that you just kind of grab and go. And so here's the thing I want you to consider, especially if you've been deep in the philosophical content of this show, and that's been kind of that I've been throwing out for the last couple of episodes. The reset button again is not a lesser of any watch. The G-Shock on your wrist while you're hiking, for example, is not a downgrade from the Rexhep Rexhepi. You might have worn that to dinner, for example. It's a different tool. It's doing a different job in a different moment of your life. And so this is also watchmaking. Watchmaking is in the service of a different relationship of your time. So most healthy collections, and I mean like really mean healthy, as in like episode 10 when we're talking about it, have at least one of these in their collection. A G-Shock, a Promaster, a Prospex, a Marathon, a Sinn, a CWC, or a brand that I didn't mention, right? Something. The brand doesn't matter. The function matters. Something you can put on without taking off, that you can take off without ceremony, that you can just, let the rest of your collection rest and breathe. And so if you don't have one, I would say maybe consider, right? If you are, or if you're someone that is just, you just don't wear watches sometimes because you're doing something that could damage your watches, maybe this is a moment where you consider picking up maybe a pre-owned one for 15 or $20, right? I know my dad, he had an Armatron that he wore for decades. And so I remember when my dad passed away, I actually kept and I actually repaired, I got a different module for his Armatron, and I have that watch. Now, again, that's like a $12 watch. And again, very important to me. One that I haven't brought up in any of the episodes before, but a super important watch to me. And maybe that's why I didn't bring it up, is because it was so important. But it's a good place to put it here because it was a tool watch. My dad worked in construction. He ran a residential construction company for decades, and that was the watch he wore every single day. And so, just something to kind of think about. So now, segment 10. Let's talk about what's next. In the next episode, we're going to keep this momentum, I think, going, but we're going to pivot the lens, I would say, hard. We've we spent a lot of time on the past episodes inside Switzerland and Geneva and Le Chaux de Fonds. We're gonna go to. We spent some time in Germany. We even went to the Netherlands, but in Japan, I think implicitly through like Seiko and Citizen, and then we briefly went to Britain with CWC. So in the next episode, we're gonna go someplace that this show has not gone. Guess what? We're going to America. So this is going to come up with or what I'm going to do my best to discuss is American watchmaking. And I think one of the most extraordinary and then also painful and quietly hopeful stories in this entire industry. I'm going to be, again, trying to do my best to tell this story properly. I'm going to go from like the late 1800s to the 1900s. I'm going to talk about American watchmaking. Maybe I'll cover Waltham or Elgin or Hamilton or Illinois or Gruen or Howard, maybe others, and the United States and how they outproduced Switzerland for decades, right? And a brand that people didn't even discuss, right? And one of the ones that I could have discussed for tool watches might have been like Timex, for example, right? We invented, I say we as in I was part of it, but as an American, I guess, the production line. We invented railroads and railroad chronometers and these factories that were the size of city blocks that were turning out millions of watches a year. And then across the 20th century, it died almost completely. So by the year like 2000, for example, American watchmaking, the industry was, for practical purposes, gone. And I think in the last 15 years, it's started to change. Small number of independent makers have started to rebuild this industry from scratch, and some of them are doing like extraordinary work. J.N. Shapiro, for example, in Los Angeles, made the first 100% American watch in modern history. RGM in Pennsylvania, for example, they've been quietly running like the longest tenured American independent operation for like 30 years. Cameron with Weiss watches, they launched in Los Angeles with their own in-house American caliber and then have moved over, I believe, to Tennessee now. Vortic Watch Company in Colorado, they're literally rebuilding modern watches that they found, and they kind of restored 100-year-old American pocket watches movements. There's Cincinnati, like Cincinnati of all places. There's a small brand that's picking up the heritage and the historic feel of Gruen Watch Company. The old factory still stands just a few miles from their new workshop. And then I'm going to throw again, hopefully, a couple of other honorable mentions in there as I do my homework for the next episode. And in the middle of that, I think I'm going to spend some time in some real piece of American watchmaking. And I'm also going to get into some of the scandals. In 2018, there was an FTC investigation that forced an entire industry to figure out what made in USA actually means, because we're not allowed to put made in USA if it's not 100%. And unlike the Swiss, where they can get away with having a bulk of it being completed in other places, the US doesn't play like that. So that's going to be coming up in the next episode. Okay, so that's episode 14 of What's on Your Restay. If you found this episode great, awesome, enlightening, maybe not enlightening. If you found this episode and you felt like it gave you permission to go love a tool watch again, or one that's been sitting in your box that you haven't put on for a while and you've been quietly maybe side-eyeing another one, I think that's the whole point. Order the G-Shock, buy the Fugu, get that SKX off the used market if you still can, or go find a marathon to put on your wrist for a month and see what you think. Tool watches are fun. They're useful. They make the rest of the collection, I think, make sense to everyone who's served or is serving in any of the military contracts that give us these brands. Thank you. Genuinely, thank you. Thank you for keeping people safe on this planet. And thank you for protecting people who, may not even appreciate the work that you do. Know that you're appreciated here, and my little ones and myself, we have you guys in our thoughts and prayers constantly. And so many of you I know possibly are listening now because I've gotten some messages from military folks. And so I think the hobby is richer because the work that they do is serious enough to require serious watches, and we get to benefit from that. So I am Watchovski. Take care of yourselves and wear something good. Maybe a tool watch this week.
You wear it on the run, you wear it in the smoke. When the grid goes dark, that old steel still knows. G-Shock on your wrist, CWC by the seal. Marathon in the mud, ticking through the reel. You jump